Imagine a war where time itself is the weapon. Every extra day you take to build a ship, hundreds of men die at sea waiting for it. That was America's nightmare in 1941. The nation needed cargo ships, fast. Not luxury liners or warships, just floating lifelines that could carry tanks, fuel, and food to the front. But building one ship took about 230 days. At that rate, the war would be over before the ships were ready. And then came one man, an ordinary civilian, not a general, not an engineer, not even a shipbuilder, who looked at that impossible problem and said, what if it didn't have to take that long? His name was Henry Kaiser, and what he did next would make shipyards look like magic factories, turning steel and sweat into vessels so fast that the world thought the reports were fake. The government said it was impossible. The engineers said it was madness. Yet within months, Kaiser's yards were launching a new ship every 4 days. To understand how one man pulled off this miracle, you have to go inside his mind. Because this wasn't just an engineering breakthrough. It was psychological warfare against the limits of what people believed they could do. Kaiser wasn't a shipbuilder by trade. Before the war, he built roads and dams, the Hoover Dam, the Grand Coulee Dam, massive projects that demanded coordination at a scale few humans had ever seen. He understood one thing: speed isn't about moving faster, it's about removing friction. He looked at shipbuilding the way an engineer looks at a bottleneck in a system. While others obsessed over design perfection, he obsessed over flow. If steel plates sat idle waiting for riveters, that was wasted time. If workers waited for parts to arrive, that was wasted motion. Every pause was a leak in the system, and he was going to seal them all. When the U.S. Maritime Commission first asked him to build ships, he had never built one in his life. And that was his advantage. He didn't carry the mental baggage of how things are done. He brought an outsider's eye to an insider's problem. He studied the process step by step and realized something shocking. The reason ships took 230 days wasn't because they had to, it was because people accepted that they did. Kaiser's first move was to challenge the sacred idea that ships had to be built one at a time, piece by piece, in sequence. Traditional shipyards were like artisans' workshops, skilled men working linearly, crafting one ship from keel to deck. Kaiser flipped that logic entirely. He broke the process into fragments and assigned each fragment to a team. Instead of one ship crawling toward completion, dozens of sections were built simultaneously, each by specialized crews who became experts at just one thing. It wasn't shipbuilding anymore, it was ship assembly. Then came his second and perhaps most genius insight. If Ford could build cars on an assembly line, why couldn't America build ships the same way? So he imported ideas from Detroit: prefabrication, standardization, repetition. He didn't try to make every ship unique, he made them identical. Because in war, perfection is useless if it's too late. Soon, shipyards that had once seemed frozen in slow motion were alive with coordinated chaos. Hundreds of cranes swinging steel sections into place, thousands of welders fusing seams day and night. Kaiser even revolutionized who could work. When the labor pool ran dry, he ignored tradition and brought in women, tens of thousands of them. Housewives, clerks, even high school girls. They became welders, riveters, and crane operators. Rosie the Riveter wasn't a symbol, she was his invention. While other industrialists scoffed at the idea of women in hard labor, Kaiser didn't care about convention. He cared about results. But all this innovation came with resistance. Navy officials accused him of recklessness. They said his methods would produce floating disasters. A ship built that fast, one admiral said, will sink before it reaches the ocean. But Kaiser had a secret weapon: belief. Not blind optimism, but an unshakable conviction that people rise to the level of the expectations you set for them. He told his workers they weren't just building ships, they were shortening the war. Every hour saved meant lives saved. And something strange began to happen. Productivity exploded. Men and women who had never built anything larger than a shed were launching steel giants into the sea. In 1942, one of his yards completed the SS Robert E. Perry in just 4 days and 15 hours. Newspapers thought it was propaganda. How could a process that once took 8 months be compressed into less than a week? But it was real. Every bolt, every weld, every plank done in record time. The ship sailed and it floated. It was a triumph of will over routine. What made Kaiser different wasn't that he worked harder. It's that he refused to see the way it's always been done as sacred. He understood that tradition is often the enemy of speed. His teams were told, if something feels unnecessary, question it. If it slows you down, eliminate it. And that mindset spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about ships anymore. It was about reprogramming how Americans thought about work itself. One worker later said, "We didn't know it couldn't be done, so we just did it." That was Kaiser's genius. He made the impossible feel ordinary. He didn't motivate with speeches or slogans. He led with proof. Every ship launched was a message. See, you thought it couldn't be done. Now do it again, faster. He also understood that morale was a weapon. His shipyards had cafeterias, medical care, even child care centers for working mothers, unheard of in the 1940s. People worked grueling hours, but they were treated with dignity. That wasn't kindness, it was strategy. A respected worker works faster and cares more. And when thousands of those workers share the same mission, they move like an unstoppable force. Still, the sheer scale of what he was doing seemed unbelievable. Entire cities had to be built around his shipyards. Richmond, California became one of the fastest-growing cities in America practically overnight. Trains carried workers in shifts around the clock. The sound of hammering and welding became the heartbeat of the war effort. By 1945, his yards had produced over 1,500 Liberty ships, more than any other contractor in the world. But the true brilliance wasn't just speed, it was the mindset shift that made that speed possible. Kaiser realized something that applies far beyond shipbuilding. The moment you stop respecting the old limits, new ones appear. The difference between impossible and done isn't time, it's perspective. Think about it. In every field, there's an accepted pace, a belief that things take as long as they take. But most of that is just inertia disguised as wisdom. Someone once said, "It takes years to master this." But who decided that? How much of your own life still runs on rules made by people who stopped asking if those rules made sense? Kaiser didn't wait for permission to rewrite the rules. He built his own blueprint for progress, one rooted in momentum and morale. Every innovation, from prefabrication to assembly line efficiency, started with a single thought: what if the limit is an illusion? And when that thought spread to tens of thousands of workers, it transformed not just an industry, but an entire war effort. And yet, what's fascinating is that Kaiser never saw himself as a hero. He called himself a builder, nothing more. To him, these ships weren't symbols, they were proof that ordinary people, given belief and structure, could outpace even the machines of war. That's the real story of the Liberty ships. Not just steel and rivets, but a psychological revolution, an industrial uprising against the impossible. And when you strip away the scale and the noise, it comes down to something universal: the idea that most limits are just habits in disguise. The irony is that Kaiser's so-called impossible trick wasn't even a trick. It was a principle, one so simple that most experts overlooked it entirely. Speed is born from clarity. The old shipyards were mazes of confusion, parts misplaced, schedules overlapping, responsibilities blurred. Workers were skilled but disorganized. Everyone was busy, but no one was synchronized. Kaiser realized that speed couldn't come from yelling louder or pushing harder. It came from simplifying everything until it flowed like a single heartbeat. He began by asking one question: what exactly slows us down? The answers poured in, waiting for instructions, missing materials, outdated blueprints. So he tore the system apart and rebuilt it from scratch. Every job had a sequence. Every sequence had a time frame. Every time frame had accountability. He transformed the chaos of a shipyard into the precision of an orchestra. To the workers, it felt strange at first, almost militaristic. But soon they realized this wasn't about control, it was about freedom. When you know exactly what to do and when, you stop wasting energy thinking about the next move. You just move. The rhythm became addictive. Crews competed to outpace one another, friendly rivalries formed, and every new record broke the last. Kaiser also noticed something crucial. Fatigue wasn't the enemy, monotony was. When workers felt like cogs in a machine, their output collapsed. So he did something unheard of. He gave them context. He made sure every welder, every riveter knew why their task mattered. Posters across the yards read, "A ship a day keeps Hitler away." It sounds simple, almost childish, but it worked. Because purpose fuels stamina more than caffeine ever could. And that's when the tempo became unstoppable. Ship hulls started rising like skeletons of giants. Sparks flew like fireflies over the night shift. Trains arrived with endless streams of steel, and workers cheered every time a new section clicked into place. There was a sense of awe, even among the workers themselves. They could see the impossible happening in front of their eyes. The funny part is, even the Navy eventually had to admit defeat, not in battle, but in belief. They sent inspectors to find flaws, expecting disaster. Instead, they found craftsmanship so efficient it defied logic. The ships weren't perfect, but they didn't have to be. Perfection was the enemy of progress. What mattered was that they floated, they sailed, and they delivered. At its peak, Kaiser's operation could churn out an entire Liberty ship in just under 100 hours. Think about that. 100 hours to build something the size of a small skyscraper, with 250,000 parts, miles of wiring, and enough steel to weigh 14,000 tons. And he wasn't doing this once. He was doing it over and over again, faster each time. But what's more fascinating than the logistics is the psychology. Kaiser's real gift wasn't in engineering or planning. It was in understanding human momentum. He believed that once people see progress, they crave more of it. It's why his yards were designed so every worker could witness the ship's growth. You didn't work in isolation. You worked inside of the mission. He even installed loudspeakers that would announce milestones in real time. Hull 271 complete. Launch in 3 days. That sound, that countdown, made the impossible feel tangible. Everyone wanted to be part of the next announcement. Everyone wanted to move the clock faster. The world started paying attention. Newspapers called his shipyards industrial miracles. Time magazine dubbed him the Miracle Man. But Kaiser didn't chase praise. When a reporter asked how he did it, he said, "We just removed the excuses." That line stuck because it cut through everything. Every slow system, every failing company, every stuck mind, all run on the same fuel, excuses disguised as rules. And that's what makes this story more than history. It's a mirror. Look at any challenge in your own life, any dream that feels too big or too slow. It's the same psychology. You think it takes years because someone said it does. You think it's hard because everyone else treats it like it is. But if one civilian with no naval experience could compress 230 days into 4, then what's really limiting you? Of course, not everything Kaiser did was smooth. His yards were plagued by turnover, exhaustion, even sabotage attempts. But here's what's remarkable. He turned every failure into a system improvement. If a process broke down, it didn't get punished, it got redesigned. If a worker made a mistake, he didn't fire them, he studied why it happened. That's how he turned setbacks into blueprints. There's a moment that sums it all up. When Kaiser's team proposed welding instead of riveting, the industry laughed. Riveting was tradition. Welding was too risky. But riveting required 3 workers per joint, while welding needed 1. It was faster, stronger, cleaner. So Kaiser ignored the laughter and adopted it anyway. That single change shaved weeks off every build. Eventually, everyone else copied him. That's the essence of innovation. doing the thing that seems foolish until it becomes obvious. And maybe that's what makes the Liberty ships such a haunting symbol. They weren't elegant, they weren't glamorous, but they were proof that speed, belief, and organization could win wars just as much as bullets and bombs. Imagine standing there in 1943, watching a new ship slide into the water every few days. Each one stamped with a name, a purpose, and the invisible fingerprints of thousands of workers who believed in something bigger than themselves. That's not production, that's momentum turned into matter. And here's what people often forget. When the war ended, Kaiser didn't stop. He applied the same mindset to peacetime industries, housing, healthcare, even aviation. He built entire cities and created one of the first modern health plans in America because he realized the principle never changes. Speed and compassion aren't opposites. They're twins born from clarity. But the deeper lesson, the one most people miss, is how belief scales. When one man believes something is possible, he creates a ripple. But when he convinces thousands, that ripple becomes a current that moves history. Kaiser didn't build ships alone. He built a culture that refused to believe in impossible. And in that sense, his story is less about steel and more about psychology, the psychology of acceleration. Once you break one impossible limit, you never look at any other limit the same way again. There's a moment in every great story where the impossible becomes ordinary and nobody even notices it happening. In Kaiser's shipyards, that moment came quietly. One morning, a Liberty ship was launched and no one cheered. No photographers, no fanfare, just another day. Because by then, producing a ship in days instead of months wasn't shocking anymore. It was routine. That's when Kaiser knew he'd won. Not just the war of production, but the war of belief. He had shifted what people thought humans were capable of. But it didn't start with grand speeches or slogans. It started with what looked like 1,000 small, boring changes. Like rearranging tool stations so workers didn't have to walk 10 extra steps. Or adjusting lunch breaks to keep machinery in constant rotation. Or redesigning work shifts so fresh teams always overlapped with tired ones for seamless handovers. Every second saved added up. It was the compound interest of efficiency. People underestimate that. They think revolutions are explosions, but most are slow chemical reactions that quietly change everything. Kaiser's genius was realizing that if you remove 1 minute of waste from 10,000 workers, you don't save a minute, you save weeks. That's how you beat an empire. Not with a sword, but with a stopwatch. He also saw that efficiency wasn't just mechanical, it was emotional. Stress, confusion, pride, and boredom all had measurable effects on output. So he built environments that balanced intensity with humanity. At a time when factory conditions were harsh, Kaiser's yards had music playing during shifts, safety officers who actually cared, and cafeterias serving hot meals around the clock. There were even contests for best-performing teams, not for bonuses, for recognition. Because he knew what most leaders still forget. People don't move faster when they're threatened. They move faster when they're seen. The human side of his operation became its engine. You could feel it in the air, the urgency, the pride, the adrenaline. Workers didn't clock in for a paycheck. They clocked in for history. They knew that somewhere across the ocean, soldiers were waiting for those ships to arrive. That connection turned labor into purpose, and purpose into acceleration. But Kaiser's operation wasn't without tension. The unions pushed back, fearing automation and assembly line methods would erase skilled trades. Traditional shipbuilders saw him as a dangerous outsider, someone willing to trade quality for speed. But here's where Kaiser's subtle brilliance appeared again. He didn't fight them head-on. He absorbed them. He listened, adapted, and found ways to protect craftsmanship within his system. Riveters became welding supervisors. Carpenters became section leaders. The old guard didn't vanish, they evolved. And by giving them ownership in his new system, he turned his fiercest critics into believers. Still, there were cracks. The pace was brutal. People collapsed from exhaustion, and turnover soared in the early months. Families complained.
Newspapers questioned whether this pace was sustainable, but Kaiser saw it differently. He didn't want sustainability, he wanted transformation. You can't stretch human limits without breaking a few of them first. And the ones who stayed, the ones who endured the noise, the heat, the steel, they came out transformed. They had seen what collective focus could do. There's an almost spiritual truth hidden here. When a group of people align around a single mission so completely, they become something larger than themselves. The boundaries between individual ambition and collective purpose blur. You stop thinking about my job and start thinking about our victory. That's when human potential multiplies. And this is exactly what Kaiser engineered, not a system, but a psychological state. He removed friction from workflow, yes, but he also removed friction from belief. No one in his yards was allowed to say, "It can't be done." If something failed, they asked why, until the failure turned into a formula. That's what separated his shipyards from every other industrial operation at the time. His managers didn't issue orders, they issued clarity. Every morning began with updates. How many ships were completed? What stood in the way? What needed fixing? There were no secrets, no confusion. Everyone knew the goal, and that made it inevitable. When you create total transparency, you create total ownership. But what truly sealed Kaiser's legend was his response to crisis. During one launch, a whole section buckled, a mistake that could have set production back by weeks. Instead of calling for punishment, he called for breakfast, literally. He gathered the foremen, brought them coffee and eggs, and said, "We're not here to assign blame, we're here to learn." By lunchtime, the problem was solved and the design improved. That's how he built loyalty so deep it outlasted the war. And then, just when everyone thought the limits had been reached, Kaiser started dreaming bigger. Why stop at Liberty ships? Why not tankers? Why not hospital ships? Why not build faster than even he thought possible? So he did. He experimented with new ship types, created round-the-clock shifts with rotating leadership, and established a pattern that modern industries still copy: modular assembly. The concept was simple. You could build the front of a ship in one state, the back in another, and weld them together somewhere else. The result? Even more speed, even less downtime. It was like building a jigsaw puzzle on a national scale. His shipyards were now operating with the precision of a living organism. Every motion mattered, every delay was tracked. But here's what's wild. Despite all this structure, it never felt robotic. It felt alive. Because at the center of it all was a man who believed that industrial power didn't have to crush human spirit, it could amplify it. When Kaiser spoke to his workers, he didn't talk about patriotism or politics.
He said things like, "Let's make history laugh at how slow we used to be." It was equal parts challenge and prophecy. And he was right. By the end of the war, the United States had produced more ships, planes, and tanks than the Axis could ever hope to destroy. But the real story isn't in the numbers, it's in what those numbers revealed. That human systems fail not because people are lazy or weak, but because the structure they live in traps them. Change the structure, and the people change with it. That's what Henry Kaiser proved. If you look closely, every innovation he made was about liberation, freeing humans from inefficiency, from confusion, from limitation. His impossible trick was nothing mystical. It was clarity, coordination, and courage applied so relentlessly that the world mistook it for magic. By the time 1945 arrived, the miracle had become normal. Liberty ships were no longer the underdog of the war. They were the backbone of it. Thousands of them, gliding across oceans, carrying tanks, fuel, medicine, and hope. They weren't beautiful ships. They were slow, awkward, and plain. But they were the reason soldiers didn't starve, why fronts didn't collapse, why invasions could even happen. And behind that plain steel was something invisible yet louder than any engine. The willpower of a man who refused to believe in limits. Henry Kaiser had built more than ships. He'd built a new idea of what possible meant. Even after the war, people couldn't stop asking, how did he do it? How did a civilian with no background in naval engineering outperform the greatest shipbuilders in history? The answer wasn't one thing. It was everything. Mindset, structure, emotion, purpose, all woven into a single unstoppable force. He often said, "Problems are only opportunities in work clothes." That one sentence explained his entire life. Where others saw barriers, he saw bottlenecks waiting to be redesigned. He treated every delay, every inefficiency, every "that's just how it's done" as an invitation to reinvent. To him, the word impossible wasn't a warning, it was a map. It pointed to the exact spot where innovation should begin. After the war, he didn't slow down. In fact, he accelerated. He entered industries he'd never touched before and rewrote their playbooks just like he did with shipbuilding. He built cars, housing developments, and eventually created Kaiser Permanente, one of the first prepaid healthcare systems in the world. His logic was simple. If people can't work when they're sick, then true efficiency begins with health. It wasn't philanthropy, it was systems thinking, applied to human life itself. But if you strip everything away, the cranes, the steel, the factories, what made Kaiser's story timeless wasn't machinery, it was psychology. He tapped into something fundamental, the human hunger for progress. When people see tangible proof that they're part of something larger, they stop clock-watching and start building.
He replaced orders with ownership. He gave every worker, from the janitor to the foreman, a stake in the victory. That's why his yards didn't just run, they roared. One worker once said, "You couldn't go slow, even if you wanted to. The pace carried you." That's momentum at its purest form, not forced, but contagious. And that's why his story still matters. Because today, the same principle applies everywhere. Companies, creators, even entire nations still struggle with the same disease he cured, the worship of tradition. Most people don't fail because they lack talent. They failed because they over-respect what came before them. They assume the rules are fixed, the timeline sacred, the standards immovable. But every once in a while, someone like Kaiser appears. A person who looks at the same wall everyone else sees, and instead of asking, "How do I climb it?" they ask, "Why does it even exist?" That's how revolutions start, not with rebellion, but with curiosity. When you look closely at Kaiser's timeline, the pattern becomes clear. Every breakthrough he made began with a question no one else dared to ask. Why does a dam have to take 20 years to build? Why can't workers with no experience outperform experts? Why should healthcare be reactive instead of preventive? Why should we wait for permission to fix what's broken? Those questions are still dangerous because they threaten comfort. They expose how much of impossible is just habit. And this is where the deeper power of his story hides, not in the ships themselves, but in what they symbolize. Each Liberty ship wasn't just a vessel, it was a declaration. It said, "We will not accept the limits you hand us." That message echoed through every dock, every home front, every soldier watching from the deck. It was proof that speed, done right, is mercy. Every extra day saved meant another convoy arrived before a U-boat could strike. Efficiency wasn't about profit, it was about survival. But even Kaiser had his breaking point. After the war, the world wanted to return to normal. Bureaucracy crept back in. Innovation slowed. His methods, once celebrated, were now too radical for peacetime industries. Yet Kaiser didn't care. He said, "If your ideas don't scare you, they're not big enough." He moved on, always searching for the next impossible frontier. And maybe that's why his legacy feels so electric even today, because it isn't trapped in the past. You can apply his philosophy to anything: how you create, how you build, how you live. His principle was never about ships. It was acceleration without panic, progress without perfection, and belief without ego. Look at any modern success story and you'll see his fingerprints. The first iPhone was built under impossible deadlines. SpaceX reuses rockets once thought expendable. Even startups that grow from a garage to a global brand overnight, they're all following the same invisible law. Move so fast that the world questions if you're lying.
But here's the part most people miss. Speed alone isn't power. Unfocused speed is chaos. Kaiser didn't just go faster, he aligned everyone's direction first. That's what made his pace sustainable. He proved that velocity without vision is just noise, but velocity with clarity changes the world. And there's something hauntingly human in that lesson, because every one of us at some point faces a personal shipyard moment, a place where the odds are stacked, the timeline's impossible, and the experts say you can't. Most people retreat. A few reimagine. The rarest few, like Kaiser, build anyway, and in doing so, they make history bend. That's what the Liberty ships ultimately represented. Not just metal or production speed, but defiance. Against tradition, against hesitation, against the comfortable pace of mediocrity. So when you hear that one civilian's impossible trick made ships appear every 4 days instead of 230, remember this. The real trick wasn't faster welding or better scheduling. It was belief, scaled to an industrial level. It was the discovery that the moment you stop asking, how long will it take, and start asking, what's stopping us, time itself starts to obey you.